people who have gone out for a pack of cigarettes and never went back to your family, what happened after you left? Story 1. I got married right out of high school. Everything was going well, but we were young and both were our first partners. Came home early one day and walked into my wife with another man. Standard insanity ensued, followed by begging for forgiveness, and we went to months of counseling. Everything seemed well and dandy. She seemed like a totally different woman and couldn't live without me. One day I logged into our desktop PC and her Facebook is loaded. There were multiple messages and I had to look. I found exactly what I knew I would find. It crushed me, but I acted as if nothing happened. That weekend, I packed up my favorite clothes and belongings that meant a lot to me and snuck them into the car. Sunday evening, I said, "Hey, I'm going to take the dogs to the dog park and hike for a few hours." When I left, I texted our neighbor to see if anyone showed up at the house. She replied pretty quickly that a male visitor was by very quickly. I told her goodbye and the dogs, and I just drove. I had decent savings and thought, screw it, start off somewhere new. And that is what I did. My ex-wife didn't even try and contact me until around lunchtime the next day. When I didn't respond, she blew me up with photos and videos of her with multiple men, and about how bad of a lover I was. It messed me up, but I just kept trucking. I ended up in a smaller town where I saw someone was hiring for my trade. Years later, I remarried the best human ever. I went home not long ago, and my mom posted a picture of us at a gathering. My ex hit up my Facebook and asked if we could meet up for a cup of coffee. She would like some closure. I obviously would like that as well. I have to say, for all the resentment and hatred I had towards this woman, our conversation was pleasant, and I felt better after we talked. She apologized deeply many times and didn't try to blame me for anything. After an hour and a few tears, awkward as hell in public, she asked if it was okay to get a hug. We hugged and said our goodbyes. Once I got home, I told my wife about the visit, and she got awkward for a few minutes. She left the room and I didn't follow. I thought, oh, I'm sleeping on the couch tonight. 5 minutes later, she came back crying and just gave me the biggest hug ever. She told me she forgot what I went through and she was sorry and glad our life is good. In closing, I left a terrible human for the best human ever. Story 2. I still regret not being able to say goodbye to my sister 12 years ago. I said goodbye to my brother and my mom, but I was the only one who knew I would never come back. I moved 300 miles away. I've seen my brother and my mom twice since then. I haven't seen my sister since I put her down for a nap that day before I knew I was leaving. After I left, my mom got married. My sister went to live with her grandparents. My brother chose to be homeless rather than let her mom drag him around different cities in the middle of a school year. I was able to finish school, which wouldn't have happened if I stayed. I stopped trying to accidentally walk in front of traffic or overdo my prescriptions. Started eating food. Got basically blackmailed into seeing my mom after 6 years while my ex pretended we were together. I finally found a family that actually liked me. Met my boyfriend, friends for 8 years, together for 4. Got my own cat. Have my own apartment with bills paid early. Overall, it has been great with my mom popping into my life. Story 3. I was 10 years old when my mom and dad split up. We had been expecting it, but I didn't know that my mom had packed up suitcases for herself, my sister, and me, and went to my mom's parents after school. It wasn't unusual for us to have dinner there, but then Mom sat us down and told us we'd be staying there for a while. Ended up being 6 years before we got our own place. Never got to go back to my bedroom again. My dad got remarried and his wife's daughter moved in and repainted my room. When I had to visit them, I slept on the couch while she slept in my room. Story 4. Growing up, my mother was pretty mostly emotional to me and my little sister. This included basically fabricating a false reality that my dad had divorced my mother and left her penniless, then left the state, as well as isolating us from the family members on the basis that they were bad people. Probably the worst thing she did, which I still deal with today, was turning me and my little sister against each other in these messed up scenarios. Basically, her and/or alcohol-induced rage of the day would always fall on one of us. However, whoever told the other sibling that they did something to anger my mom would face her wrath, and the other sibling would have a brief respite. This went on since I was 8 or so. I grew up hating my sister. After I got older, I found my best friend in high school, and he helped me understand just how messed up my situation was, given that I assumed that's how family life was since we were so isolated, no TV or internet. And that my mother was also a teacher at both my elementary and middle school, she had control over everything. At 18, I left my house and moved in with my friend. However, it wasn't forever. He was joining the army at the end of school and I had to think of someone to stay with. So I found my dad, states away. I took a long shot and asked him if I could stay with him. He accepted. I got everything I owned in the world, which fit in a truck bed, and while most kids were going off to college, I was going to start over in a completely different place with a father I didn't know. It turned out my dad was a decent guy. He wasn't a saint by any means, but leagues better than my mother. He helped me get a driver's license and eventually helped me join the military, where I've just finished my first year. I haven't seen my little sis in 2 years though, and she still hates me. Even though she's 18, she hasn't left her mother, and since I left, she's become closer to her. I regret not trying harder to be there for her every day. But as for my life now, I have 3 years left in the military, then I hope to go to college and become a pilot, none of which I ever thought of when I was living under my mother's roof. Hey, also, if you didn't know yet, me and a couple of my friends just launched Rufus rugs. Premium, custom hand-tufted rugs. Maybe you're just a fan of Naruto and want to show it off. Or maybe you just love Pokemon and want bus toys on display for everyone. Either way, we can make almost anything. So hit the first link in the description to learn more. Story 5. When I was 18, I moved out from my father. I was commuting to college at the time, and I had morning classes, so the night before I packed my car with as much of my stuff as I could and set off. One of my professors, whom I regularly talked to after class, noticed that my car was full of clothes and asked if everything was okay. Over lunch, I explained my situation, and he offered to take me in. I had already made arrangements to live with my mother. After my classes for the day were over, I went home for the first time since I was a child to live with my mother. I slept on the couch for months before getting my own bed, and we didn't always have the money to eat, but we made it work. I have seen my father one time since then because he swore to me that he had changed. That night he proceeded to get wasted and tried to put his hands on me. I haven't seen him since, and I have no regrets. Story 6. I hadn't started a family of my own yet, but I was engaged to my ex, who I just ended up ghosting after a few years. It was several years ago, and he had to move back to Tokyo for his job. We met in the US while he was an expat, so he asked me to come live with him. Moved, met the family, and all that stuff. But one day I came down with the flu and was miserable. And so weak I couldn't even walk myself to the toilet. He was trying to come on to me several times that day, and I kept refusing because of obvious reasons. And I was in the middle of sleeping, and he started to take off my clothes and have sex with me while I was sleeping after already refusing it to him. I woke up and was like, what the hell, and made him stop. Then I pretended to be asleep till he left for work the next morning, packed my stuff, and left. Dropped the key off at the concierge and hurried out of the building in a huge panic. Never spoke to him again. Cut off all contact immediately. I booked hotels for a couple of weeks and met my now husband. Story 7. My dad died when I was pretty young. My mom eventually remarried a pretty cool guy when I was young. He was honestly an amazing dad. He was absolutely incredible, taking care of everyone and reaffirming that I was his son. When my mom died, it was just me and him for a few years. There were some amazing times. He made sure I was seeing a counselor and we did family things on the weekend. My friends used to joke that he wasn't even my biological dad and he still made more time for me and did more things for me than their bio dad did. When I was 15, he remarried. I didn't exactly like my new stepmom, but I didn't hate her. I think I just thought that the relationship wouldn't last and he'd move on to someone better. Then they got married and it was kind of weird. I did get an amazing baby brother from that. Not all bad. My dad died when I was 17, literally taken out by an undiagnosed severe allergy. My stepmom got me from school and drove me to the hospital, and when my dad passed away, she handed me my baby brother and said she needed a minute by herself. I never saw her again. She was much younger than my dad. I was an ex-foster kid with no family or best friends to support her. And I think she looked at her newborn baby and the kid her dead husband inherited and just couldn't handle it. I sure know I wasn't prepared to handle it. But my mom and my biological dad had been ex-foster care kids, and mom told me a few stories, so I wasn't going to let that happen to me or my brother. I do sometimes feel a little resentful that I can't have a normal life. I'm working too much, and I have a 6-year-old to figure out, to consider college, but I don't want my family to just be cycles of poverty and dead-end jobs. I have full custody. My stepdad adopted me when my mom died, so for all intents and purposes, my brother is legally my brother. Afraid I can't give too many details. I want to adopt him and there's a court case or two that I don't want to compromise just in case. Movies have told me that anyway. Stepmom will probably be charged with abandonment when she can be located, but so far we haven't heard anything. I've always been worried that she had a mental health break and either killed herself. I used to call up locally and ask for Jane Does that fit her. Hey, coping mechanisms, am I right? Or she's had a mental health break and something snapped. Abandonment didn't really fit what I knew of her. And I remember that she had some kind of mental health problems. It's not like we talked about it though. She could have gone off her meds in the chaos and snapped. I'm more worried than angry, but my first concern will always be for my favorite little tyke. We're doing pretty well. We have a support worker who has been fantastic, helping us get access to free and reduced cost services. I'm also pretty thrifty. I YouTube how to knit socks and fix clothing, and thrift stores are great. I don't live near a major city, so it's not as expensive as it could have been. Being frugal also helps. Anyways, before we continue, thank you for watching our content. And if you enjoy our content and want to see more, click on that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Thanks. Now back to the video. Story 8. My ex-husband was extremely physically and emotionally abusive, as well as an alcoholic. He obsessively controlled the money in every second of my daily routine. An unplanned 5-minute delay to get gas on the way home would result in a dressing down. If I was lucky, if it wasn't. We had 3 daughters, and on the few occasions I threatened to leave, he'd tell me to go ahead and leave, but I couldn't take our daughters with me. At one of our couple friends' wedding reception, he got drunk as per usual and lost his mind over something insignificant. Dragged me around in the street by my hair and pulled a gun on me in front of the wedding party. One of his friends took me aside while the groom's mom was driving my ex home and told me, "You don't have to live like this." It was like a light went on in my mind. This guy says I don't have to live like this? It took me a couple of weeks to put a plan in place, but one morning after my ex left for work, my dad helped me pack everything that would fit in a U-Haul and I'd get out. I'd like to say I never saw him again after that day, but I was pretty lucky he decided to leave me alone after an initial period of stalking and a bout in jail for violating an order of protection. Fast forward 15 years, and I finished undergrad, law school, and postdoc. I'm remarried with 2 more amazing kids, and life is pretty amazing. Story 9. My real dad ghosted 4 families. His first family, he had a son. He was in that family for 13 years. His son had a motorcycle wreck and ended up in intensive care. A year later, he ghosted that family and moved to a new state. Just up and left. Didn't take anything but his clothes and his car. Second family, he had a daughter. He left almost immediately. Then he moved to another state, married another woman, and had 2 more kids whom I'd never met or spoken to. Don't even know their names, to be honest. Jake, John, Jordan, Josh, something with a J. He went out for a pack of smokes and never went back, his own words. Then he met my mom and had my sister first. He ghosted my mom 3 years later, then showed up for some quick whoopee, and I happened. He ghosted her but didn't leave the state. She called the cops, and my first memories of the cops bringing my dad to the house in cuffs and letting him go, only for him to attack my mom while she was holding me and she dropped me. Then the cops arrested him. He wanted out, he got out. He had 2 more marriages, but no kids. It's his MO to shack up with well-off women and mooch until they either kick him out or he gets bored. It's really painful to see because I want to be a dad who's there for his kids every second of their lives. I want to be the exact opposite of him. Story 10. My mom just all of a sudden wasn't there anymore. She and my dad were miserable, but my dad wouldn't agree to a divorce. He was a minister at a big church and didn't believe divorce was right, and so instead he tried to stay married to my mom. All while avoiding her and all the unhappiness at home, she never really left her bedroom. She was miserable, and she made everyone else miserable too. She was horrible to me in those last few years. We had been really close before that. She started moving stuff out of the house little by little when no one was home. Like one day a bookshelf would be gone, and we'd all notice but just kind of go on with our lives. And it bothers me very, very much. But her moving out was so abrupt and so ambiguous that I don't remember specifics about it. Like, I don't know if it was during the school year or over the summer. I don't know where I was or what was different when I came home that day. But at some point, she didn't live there anymore. I was 14. My dad told me that God told him she would never come back. He looked up to my dad a lot. He was kind of on the same level as God in my mind, so I believed him. He soon after started dating another woman, secretly because the church didn't know he was divorced yet. He intended to marry her as soon as possible. I remember I had to pose for family photos with this new woman and her 2 kids. They were printed up and put into a frame and hung over our fireplace. Then one day, my mom came to the house. She told me she had made the biggest mistake of her life, that she loved me, my brother, and my dad, and she wanted to work everything out. I guess God was wrong when he spoke to my dad. And she walked out of my room and saw the new family portrait over the fireplace. She left quickly. A few days later, she called the house. My dad answered, and she told him to tell the kids I said goodbye. Then she hung up. We started calling everyone we could think to call. We tried to call the phone operator, asking if they could trace the call. This was 1995, so no caller ID or cell phone with a callback number. A bit later that night, my new stepmom-to-be came over and pulled my dad aside. She saw a car at the end of our neighborhood that looked like my mom's. My dad called 911, everyone showed up, my mom had taken a bucket of pills, she was barely alive. They took her to the ER and pumped her stomach and intubated her. They told my dad to call my brother so he could come and say his goodbyes too. I was led into the room for a while. I looked at the machines and they were plugged into the wall. I stared for a long time, thinking I should unplug them, because she really didn't want to be revived and I couldn't understand why we were doing all of this. But then a nurse came in and said I had to leave while they did stuff. My mom survived. My dad married the other lady. I think this messed me up and I honestly can't believe I've typed up this entire recollection. I don't think about it very often, and maybe that's why I can't remember the details of the day I realized she'd moved out. Story 11. When I was 5, my dad came home from work, and my mom informed him out of the blue that she wanted an immediate divorce. I found out many years later she'd had an affair and was pregnant. He moved out of the house, they had 3 little kids together. I was the oldest, and she married her second husband, twice. They weren't divorced the first time. He was paying child support as he was supposed to, but she was calling him at work and sending him letters to home. His sister kept them, asking for more, and he began to get complaints about it from his bosses. He asked his mother what he should do. She advised him to tell her he was giving her all he could, and all he was ordered to, and that he was going to lose his job if she kept it up, and that if she didn't stop, he'd leave the state, and she'd never hear from him again. She thought that would make her wise up and leave him alone, so he did. But she continued. So he asked his mother for advice again. Her advice was to follow through. And so he did. He packed his clothes into the car and he headed for Canada. He got as far as 2 states north from where he began, like a little town he came across, and got a job there. I never forgot him. I was the only one of the 3 of us kids who had any memories of him. But when I was 16 and moved away from my extremely home, in every way, I called my aunt, whose name I knew, who happened to live in the town I was also then living in, and told her I wanted to meet him. Coincidentally, he happened to be visiting her. I met him, my aunt, my grandfather, and my grandmother while he was there. It turned out to be the only time I would ever meet my grandfather. He died 2 years later, but I will never ever forget it. He wrapped me up in a big, strong bear hug, how much he loved me, and how much he'd always loved me, and how very, very happy he was to see me again after all these years. I cried then, and I'm crying again now, writing it down. I can still feel the love and care in his arms. I wasn't ready to get to know my dad at 16, though. I realized now that I just wanted to see him. It took me another 10 years before I contacted him again, but I did, and I was living in California. And when I did, he took 2 weeks vacation. So did I. Drove down to see me, and we spent the entire 2 weeks getting to know one another. And once he left, we were in contact daily. And I quit my job and moved up a month later because I knew the hole in my heart would never be filled until my dad was a part of my life. I was correct. My son has a grandpa because of my decision. My dad is the greatest grandpa there is. I wish he'd always been in my life, but the outcome I received is worth everything I've been through. I love you, Dad. Story 12. I grew up in a very abusive and strict home. My stepfather, both my sisters, and then when they left, I was next. Anyways, one night he made me walk home from the mall because he wouldn't give me a ride. I called and asked around 5 and he said, "You better have your home at 5. I walked the 8 miles and was pretty wiped out when I was coming up the driveway. We had a big front window and I saw him sitting in his chair drinking whiskey and waiting for me. When I walked in, he said something and I replied, "You won't do crap." The next thing I knew, he had me pinned to the wall and punched me in the face until I was knocked out. When I woke up, I remember feeling the blood from my nose, and my mother was standing there and told me I was a disgrace and to go clean my face off. I went upstairs and grabbed a hat and walked out and never went back. I was 14 years old at the time.
If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out this next video. The YouTube algorithm really thinks you like it.